Welcome to this week's episode of the Compliance Digest, presenting topics on all things compliance related. My name is Alex Krenke, and joining me this week is Kate Lucchesi, one of the account executives at Quest CE. Kate, welcome.
Thank you.
This week we're going to be talking about the annual report, which just came out from FINRA, that they're posting some consistent results from what we saw last year, and that pretty much is indicating that the stagnant revenue and then the rising compensation costs, which have been really a concern with some of the broker-dealers out there. So Kate, today, if you could just dig into what's going on over at FINRA.
Sure, Alex. We're seeing FINRA's revenue staying the same while expenses are soaring, largely in part to the regulatory fees being lower in past years. While compensation within FINRA continues to grow. In the latest annual report released by FINRA, FINRA's biggest revenue source, regulatory fees, as many of you know, remains lower than past years. As hard as it is to believe, they're down 10% from the 2008 peak at about $406.9 million reported in 2012. While the fees are down, FINRA has stated in their annual report for 2012 that 63% of their total expenses constitute of employee compensation and benefits. Costs have been growing 3% to 4% annually with contractor conversions to permanent staff. The FINRA staff headcount has risen in the last few years due to FINRA creating a new in-house market regulation center where in past years, they use an outside vendor.
And that's something I think you expect when you see somebody move something from outsourcing it to moving it in-house. You do see typically a rise in cost, but what you hope for is an increase in quality and consistency over time, so you hope it offsets it. One of the other things I just wanted to dig into is the incoming revenue stream and how it's being impacted, and a couple of factors that may be impacting it. So the first one I want to talk about is the environment out there for the broker-dealer market versus the registered investment advisory market. And then the second one is the impact that FINRA not receiving regulatory oversight over the investment advisors had on FINRA.
Well, there are quite a few factors, as you have just mentioned, a couple that have impacted the incoming revenue for FINRA. With the decline of broker-dealers in the last few years, regulatory fees, the biggest revenue line for FINRA covers the trading activity fee, the personal assessments for registered persons, gross income assessments against firms, and branch office assessments. At the end of May, FINRA reported 4,248 member firms, and this is down 13.2% from 2008, which you can see why this could impact the revenue. With this news coming from FINRA, it makes sense why you saw a driving force from them to oversee those RIAs. In my opinion, as I'm sure many of you probably agree, this is just another way that FINRA is trying to increase their revenue. They believe that the current levels of investment advisor regulation need to be addressed for investor protection.
And I think that was something that we were waiting on the outcome for the last couple of years, and it certainly didn't go the way that they were reporting at the annual FINRA conference. I know that during Richard Ketchum's keynote speech last year that they expected to actually receive oversight over the investment advisors. Didn't really happen. Another thing I think it's important to discuss is the other side of the coin. So let's talk about the costs going up over time. You mentioned earlier that a lot of the costs are associated with employee costs. And you can make the argument that you have to pay more for better talent. But the other thing I want to focus on too is the impact that this will likely have on the broker-dealers out there. Do we expect that these fees will be pushed onto them?
Just like you said, FINRA is paying more out in employee compensation to retain employees with increases in incentive, compensation, employee merit, and promotions. This upward climb of compensation has seen complaints from many member firms in regards to the management of FINRA and pay levels. Also, FINRA is, they're out there and competing with other financial firms and law firms for, that talent that's out in the industry. And so to retain that talent, they, are increasing that compensation. One thing to kind of note, and I think is kind of interesting, is that the increased fees on the broker-dealers actually allowed for FINRA to make a profit last year. However, the organization still, in a whole, posted an operation loss of $89.2 million last year, a little less than the previous year. This increase in fees on the broker-dealer has definitely impacted the decline of broker-dealers, and thus creating lower trading volumes. FINRA had felt the effect of this, making the decision to increase fees for member firms worth almost $60 million a year.
And I think from our perspective, it's easy to understand that from FINRA's perspective, if you're having these 2 years in a row of stagnant results in that revenue is kind of sitting still, but the costs are increasing, probably the easiest way to increase your revenue is to increase fees. So that might be an indicator of what we're seeing right now. But as we've mentioned, it's probably too early to determine if this is a trend or if this is just something that we're seeing right now for them to get over the hump. That'll actually cover it for this week's episode. I want to thank you again, Kate, for joining us today and talking about the FINRA annual report. Join us next week for another exciting episode of the Compliance Digest.